Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psych the Podcast with your host, B&B. My name is Brianna.
My name is Brittany.
Yes, welcome, welcome. And just to remind you all, Psych the Podcast, our purpose is to create content for diverse students interested in earning their PhD in psychology.
Absolutely. And today we have special guest, Dr. Thema Bryant. And I'll let you all know a little bit about her, even though you all should know who she is. So, Dr. Thema Bryant is a clinical psychologist and president-elect of the American Psychological Association. She is also a professor of psychology at Pepperdine University and an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Thema earned her doctorate from Duke University and completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School. She is a former psychology representative to the United Nations and a past president of the Society of the Psychology of Women. With more than 20 years of experience in trauma recovery, she has appeared as a mental health expert on radio, print media, and television, including CNN, WeTV, Headline News, BET, OWN TV, and VH1. Dr. Thema raises awareness about mental health issues on the Homecoming podcast and her social media platforms. Her expertise is in empowering people to survive, heal, and thrive. We are so grateful to have you today, Dr. Bryant.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this platform and that you all are providing the information, which means you're providing empowerment. And I'm excited for today's conversation.
Get started here. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to psychology and how you got into it?
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up primarily in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was a pastor's daughter. And in our community, people often went to their pastor for pastoral care and for counseling. And my mother led a women's ministry, and that also really focused on holistic health and well-being and empowerment. So through their work was my first introduction to the therapeutic process. And then as I got older, I learned that psychology was a field in and of itself. And so I really feel that it is sacred work, that it is a calling, and the work that I love to do. Within psychology, my focus is trauma recovery. And that came about both from my individual experience with trauma, but also the realities of collective trauma. So, as I mentioned, I primarily grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which, while it is a beautiful place, there is also can be a lot of community violence and school violence. And then, as an adolescent, I was blessed to be able to move to Liberia, West Africa, and the first year was absolutely amazing in terms of coming home to my full identity and culture and heritage. And then, unfortunately, the end of my second year there, a civil war broke out, which, of course, is another form of trauma. And so I have always really had a heart for helping people through difficult circumstances that can kind of turn us upside down and look at how do we individually, within our families, and then within communities, heal so that we can survive and hopefully also thrive.
Yeah, I hear a lot about trauma and identity and spiritual practices. And, that's really needed within the community. And another reason why we're so grateful to have you here today. I'm wondering if there's something more specifically that you can speak to that brought you to psychology, or even like the advice that you could give for people that want to work with trauma, or specifically, spirituality, and incorporating that in their work.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say look for the various opportunities to get engaged. And so, as a college student at Duke University, they had a program where you could work in the community, but the university would pay your salary. So you would be still a work study student.
Mhm.
And so I began working as a rape crisis counselor. And that gave me really incredible opportunities to learn advocacy, which I think is important for anyone interested in psychology, especially to empower and address the needs of marginalized communities. It also provided opportunities to learn about psychoeducation and providing community workshops. We would go into schools and do talks on good touch and bad touch. And then eventually, I also had the opportunities to do trainings, to train lawyers, train judges, to understand the ways in which people may present when they have experienced trauma. So, just by way of example, someone can share a really horrific experience, but be laughing. And if people aren't tuned into that, they may think this person must be lying, or it wasn't that deep, or it didn't really matter. So, helping people to understand psychologically the ways that people can cope with humor or deflect with humor. And so, that information is so important to be able to disseminate. And then I will also say, you may have ideas in your mind of your own limitations, but to be open to exploring what is possible. Initially, as I mentioned, what I was more aware of was practice because of the work my parents did, providing pastoral counseling. And so my initial kind of mantra was, I'm not a researcher, right? And so that was in large part based on the narrow type of research I had been exposed to. Right. And so it was really eye opening for me as a graduate student to begin doing some work with Susan Roth, who has a perspective of feminist psychology and also a real love for qualitative research, which was a very different experience for me. So when I was a master's level student, and in my first draft to my advisor, who was a different person, I turned in my document, and the paper was on conceptions of manhood and womanhood among early adults, African American adults.
Mhm.
And I had a section in there talking about the impact of racism and sexism on our racial and gender identity. And my master's advisor, who was a white man, literally said to me, now, Thema, you can say this, or you can take the high road and get published.
Mm.
So it was like, what? Now, this is someone who's very accomplished, has a whole bunch of grants. And so it was this whole piece of, you can either address racism and sexism, or you could be successful like me,
Wow.
right? Which was very silencing. And then also in the first draft, when for every sentence he would say, what's the citation, what's the citation, what's the citation? And so like all of that was like very much silencing. So when I switched advisors for my dissertation and I turned in my first draft of the proposal to Dr. Susan Roth, the first thing she said to me is, Thema, where's your voice?
Mm.
And I said, what? I said, you mean I'm allowed to say something? And she said, what would be the point otherwise? If you weren't going to say anything, why write? And so that then I could like breathe, right? And yes, build on the literature that is there. And, what is it you're trying to say, right?
Mm.
And so now, all these years later, along with having a private practice, I am also a researcher and direct my own research lab. And so, whether in research or teaching or consultation, to not limit yourself and know that you can have multiple streams of income. You can have multiple kind of pursuits, even within psychology. And the last piece I'll say about pushing past limitation is as a sexual assault survivor myself, I had in my mind that I could only work with survivors. And when I got hired for my first position after my postdoc, it was advertised as the head of the sexual assault program on a college campus. I went for the interview, everything went well. I was happy with the salary. I packed up all my stuff, moved across multiple states to get there. And it wasn't until I arrived that they told me my office was also responsible for counseling the offenders.
Mm.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wait, what? Like, I don't do that. Right. And so it was very disorienting because coming from the rape crisis background, you wouldn't have like survivors and offenders in the same waiting room, right? It just was
Mhm.
against my whole model, and something I had not anticipated. But like I had accepted the job and moved my stuff, so I had to figure it out. And it has ended up being a part of the work that I can do and am able to do. So, sometimes we have limited ourselves for various reasons, but to not be so quick to dismiss it without first trying.
Mm. Wow, thank you for sharing that and your
Yeah.
personal story within overcoming your own limitations. And I'm also wondering, going through that process, it sounds like you empowered yourself and found agency within your own voice in so
Mhm.
many ways. So I'm just wondering, what was mentorship or guidance like during that time?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it makes a difference when you have the right mentorship, right? So
Mhm.
your mentors believe in you, your good mentors believe in you. Your good mentors don't require you to censor yourself. So
Mm,
some people feel like they have to perform, like
Mhm.
feel like they have to already have all the answers. So it'll be like, what will be the point if you don't have any questions, right? If you already know everything or feel like you have to pretend to know everything.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's emotionally safe. And I want to also say this is an important one. A good mentor actually hopes you will pass them,
mm,
Wow. Yeah.
right? Like you don't want a jealous mentor, right? It doesn't
you
make
don't.
sense, right?
Mhm.
Like everybody who I advise, everyone who is a mentee, I tell them, and I would like you to do even more than this, right?
Mhm.
Because like you have a launching pad, right? So I'm giving you some information so you don't have to start from scratch, right? So for example, I graduated without publications. And I didn't even know some people were getting publications. And
Mm,
I
Mm.
later found out that my master's advisor was taking some students with him to conferences and had never invited me.
wow.
And when
Wow.
I found out, really toward the end of my time, I went to him and said, you know, I won't name names, such and such and such and such, said you took them all these places. How come I never got to go? And I'm in your lab. And he literally said, oh, I didn't think you would be interested.
Mm,
So, the students who work with me, I have them submit at conferences, present, whether it's posters or a panel with me. I really try to encourage students to work on publications. And so, because of that, then they're starting ahead of where I started when I graduated,
mm,
right? So, you want mentors who will also be advocates.
Mhm.
So that's, people who will speak up for you when you're not in the room, right? So when we're having some faculty meeting and they're needing a student who will represent in this way, is there a faculty member in the room who will put your name in the ring? Who will say,
Mhm.
oh, I think Jasmine would be great for this, right? I think such
right.
and such would be great for this. So I try to do that as a mentor, and I have had people who have mentored me. So the person I mentioned, Dr. Jessica Henderson Daniel, who's the first Black woman to be president of APA, um, she really brought me into the American Psychological Association. I
Mm,
had just graduated, and I had applied and become one of APA's representatives to the United Nations. So she at the time was president of the Society for Psychology of Women. So she put me on her executive committee and called me the liaison for international relations, right? I was still initiatives was this mentorship group for early career women of color. And so it was a group of mentors she selected, and they took a group of us mentees to dinner.
mm,
And we were Asian, Latino, Native American, Black. So we're sitting around this uh, table in this restaurant, this long table, and they tell us we're supposed to go around and say our dreams or our goals so they can help us make these dreams come true. So people are going around and saying, you know, I want to become a tenured professor. I want to start my own private practice, whatever they want to do. So the women's division is called Division 35. So when it gets to me, I say, I want to be president of Division 35 before I'm 35.
Wow.
So there was this moment of silence, right? Because they were startled. And then Jessica goes, "Are you ready to work?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "We'll make it happen." And I became
Mhm.
president of Division 35 at 34.
Look at that.
Yes.
And so she was the one, the presidential year went really well. And so immediately after that, people started talking to me about running for APA president.
Mm,
But it wasn't, at the time, I wasn't interested and it wasn't the right time. And so I will say over the past 10 years, she has continued to check in with me like, you should really run. You should really run, right? And so it's been important. It's important to have people who see your gifting, who
mhm,
believe in you, who will not only encourage you, because you can have people outside of the field, like my family is encouraging, but they don't know the steps for inside of this field, right?
right.
So it's really helpful to have not only encouragers, but people who can give you the practical steps of how to get where you want to go.
Yeah, I definitely hear this theme of using your voice, right? Whether we were talking about the limitations, but then also naming that you would be the president of Division 35 and becoming that. But then, of course, there's this mentorship piece. And Brianna and I, we've had our advisor on the podcast multiple times at this point, and love who she is as a mentor. Like she is constantly pushing us. I will never forget the time myself and someone else in our research team were applying for a fellowship. We turned in the our application to our advisor, and she said, "Y'all are not ready." She was like, "Y'all don't want this fellowship. Like y'all are not gonna get it with what y'all just sent to
Mm.
me." And we turned that around so quickly, and we both got the fellowship. Like that is,
Excellent.
but that is
Excellent.
that
That's
is the
it.
kind of thing that you need,
Right.
you know,
Yes.
with a mentor. And I love one thing about our advisor is she's always going to be very real with us, as well as she's pushing us and making sure that we get into these spaces and, you know, have the career that we want to have. Now,
Yes, I love that.
Mhm,
And here's the thing, for the students to hear in your story is you all didn't shut down, right? Sometimes when we get like
mhm,
feedback or correction,
mhm.
we can get an attitude or get embarrassed or get defensive, but you all were like, bet, right? Do the work.
We
I
were
would
like,
do the work.
okay.
yeah,
Yes, yes, beautiful. And that's a career long uh, ability. Because what happens, even if you submit articles, in most cases, you're going to get a revise and resubmit. And
Mhm.
sometimes when you open that email and see all the things people want you to do, it can feel overwhelming when you first start. And so then people can like put that letter aside and just like not work on it. But it's like, okay, people were invested the time to make my thing better. That's the point.
right.
I mean,
Mhm,
sometimes some feedback you will argue against or you say like it doesn't make sense for my paper, but for the most part the suggestions are to make it stronger, and so to not run from the feedback.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So
yeah.
another thing,
Oh, go
Brianna,
ahead,
were
Brittany.
you?
Mhm,
Because I kind of want to switch gears. Well, not switch gears, but go back to a topic that we were discussing, because I know that you focus a lot on trauma and surviving, healing, and thriving. And I think it's important for our listeners to know, how are you taking care of yourself throughout that process of, doing such heavy work.
Yeah.
And I listened to one of your speeches where you talked about how Black women are always, like, historically, we're always taking care of everyone else. So, like, how
right.
have you taken care of yourself, especially for people that are interested in doing trauma work?
Mhm,
Right. This piece of self-care and community care is so important, and I'm glad you named it in the context of our identities,
Mhm.
because it is true, as Black women, we are often, even as Black girls, raised to be the caretakers, to pay attention to everybody else's need, to, carry communities. and it's double message, right? To carry families, but then be accused of like being too strong, right? So there
Mhm.
is um, this challenge of really honoring our own humanity for us to have spaces where we don't have to fight, where
Mm.
there can be spaces where there is joy. And that's, a radical revolutionary act as a Black woman in America, that I will pursue things that bring me joy, right? I'm committed to it. Like I'm committed to delighting in my own laughter. That
Mhm.
I know how to fight, but I don't want to fight 24/7.
I'm
Mhm.
tired.
So Howard Thurman, who was a Black theologian, said, "Do the things that make you come alive, because far too people are actually alive." And that's so true. Many of us are dehumanized and, going through life as machines, right, to produce for other people or to try to gain other people's validation and approval. And so, the NAP ministry, if people follow her on social media, she talks a lot about naps as resistance, like our rest as resisting these messages that we receive, that our worthiness is dependent on our labor. And it's easy to fall into that as a graduate student, right?
Mhm.
That my identity is in my grade, right? That my validation is where is my internship site. And to know it will be nice to have those things, and I am worthy regardless.
Mhm.
One of my first doctoral students, when she applied for internship, and she was an excellent student, just happened that year she didn't get placed. So she had to wait an extra year. The following year, she was the first one of our students to place at Yale. She
Wow.
went
Mhm.
to Yale, and no one when you graduate asks like, what year did you start and when did you finish? Like nobody would know that's her story. And now she's the head of the sexual trauma department at the local VA.
Mhm.
I called the other day and she was like, "Hello, this is Dr. Blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Well, come
That's
on."
amazing.
Yes, yes. So, in terms of my care, I would say one, even being mindful of what we eat. I talk about in my book that when I first started practicing, and I was keeping my own calendar, I kept missing lunch because I would have requests from people who wanted a session, and I would frame it in my mind like this: what's more important, their healing
Mhm.
or a sandwich?
Mhm.
Like, what an outrageous way to frame it. So, of
Mhm.
course, I'm going to squeeze in another person. And so then one day I was doing counseling with a client, and in the middle of the session, my stomach starts growling. And I was like, whoa, I'm talking to them about how they are deserving of care as I'm sitting here for like the fifth hour, hungry, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I had to have a meeting with myself to say, I want to be authentic. I want to not just tell people about how to live well, I want to live well. And so looking at, even what we're eating, looking at exercise. So I love dancing. There's a great group I don't have any ties to, but I'd love to give them shout out called Kukuwa, Kukuwa. It's African dance aerobics online. And they have really
I used
Okay.
to be an African dancer.
yeah, oh, excellent. Yes. It feeds us. It's good for our bodies. It's good for our spirits. It's good for community. Movement is an important part. I start my day with devotions, and that's really important. And so, reading scripture, meditating, praying, sometimes with music, and it helps me to get centered because what I have found is if you go off and you're not grounded and your well is already empty, it
Mm.
makes you very vulnerable to
Mhm.
whatever people think, say, or do toward you,
Mhm.
right? So I like to, before I go out in the day, already have clarity. So people can, because people gonna act up, right? At every
Regardless.
level
Regardless.
you're in. Because often as Black women, we're underestimated, right? And so people will often test you and you like needing to be alert and discerning. And so if you're having to do that from an empty place,
Mm.
it will be really difficult. It's not sustainable. So I have to pour into my well. So when I show up, then I'm giving from an overflow, right? I'm not giving from a place of desperate, I'm not thirsty, right?
Mhm.
So if they affirm me, nice. If they don't, I'm good because I didn't come looking for them to tell me I was good enough. Yes.
Mhm.
So that kind of spiritual practice in whatever ways people feed their spirit to try to do that in the mornings is really important. And then I have also done my own psychotherapy. I think
Mhm.
that is important. Some people want to skip from being wounded to being the healer, and they have not
Mhm.
done their process. And that is why a lot of mental health professionals get a bad rep, where people are like, therapist, right? It's
Mhm.
like if you have, you can read all the books, but if you have not reflected on yourself
Mhm.
and engaged in actively healing your own wounds, you can enter into this field and do a lot of harm. And so that's important.
Yeah, I love what you had to say about that, about the spiritual aspect of pouring into yourself and checking on yourself. And then also, I think you spoke to, as a healer, sometimes we can inadvertently be damaging and hurting ourselves in
Hmm.
providing healing practices to others. And I really appreciate how you speak to having your own personal therapy. I started therapy this year. It's also
Oh,
the first
good.
year I started seeing clients. And so
Ah,
I've caught myself sometimes in what I'm telling my clients, like, you know what, maybe you need to check yourself too sometimes. So it's so important to, have also that balance of taking care of yourself. And it's just sometimes a check and balance with what you're giving out and making sure like you're getting poured back into or
mhm,
releasing some things, or like you said,
mhm.
being vulnerable and doing that inner work that we ask of other people as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I love that. And thank you for naming that because we help to remove the stigma, by
Mhm.
saying, yes, this is something I did and it was helpful to me. And also when you talk about, when you're talking to your clients and have these revelations, I think that's important to share because it also humanizes us, right?
Mhm.
We are not like blank slates or just sitting there with a lab coat on. When I went to my internship, it was at a training hospital, which meant the clients there every year received a new therapist, which meant over the course of their lives, they had had a lot of therapists. And so I was working with a client for the first time, and he was an immigrant from a European country, but had been here many years. And so we get to the end of the session, and he says, I can tell you didn't go to the same school as the other ones. And
Mhm.
I said, what school is that? And he said, the school where they teach you to just write in your notepad and say, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I
That's
say,
funny.
yes, sir. I didn't go to that school. I'm going to talk to you, right? And that's important. People read authenticity. And sometimes I think, especially students and trainees, have the idea that to be professional, I have to feel nothing and just be blank and neutral. And that's not healing, right? If people are
Mhm.
telling us these horrific things and we're just, anything else you want to say about that? It's like, what in the world did you just hear what this person said?
Right.
So I tell our students, we are the thermometer in the room.
Mhm.
That many times people have been through circumstances where everybody acts like it wasn't a big deal, right?
Mhm.
That everybody in the family knew this was happening to you and people ignored it or dismissed it. And so if you come and then tell that story to me and I also act like no big deal, then it's harmful. So we want to show up and be present.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes. Go ahead, Thema.
Definitely. I was wondering, having mentored students, right? What is some advice that you would give to students who are applying to graduate school or wanting to enter psychology and engage in clinical work?
Yes, wonderful. So, I would say try to get any experience that you can, experience working with people, experience in someone's research lab, even if you have to volunteer, if you don't have paid positions,
Yeah.
because we are ranking those and rating those. And so experience is important, clarity about what you're interested in, and then clarity that you have researched our particular program. So you
Mm.
need to like look on the website and see like what kinds of programs we're doing, the faculty that are there, what are they studying? So you can mention that, then it feels like this person like has done their research, has done their homework, And it's not just like, applying to anywhere and everywhere, right? But it's being
Mhm.
intentional. And then you want relationship building is important, especially when you're going to later ask people for these letters of recommendation, right? I'll have people who I taught like 4 years ago, and we've never had a conversation. They did okay in the class, but you can think about like, what kind of letter could I write them, right? So I could,
Mhm.
look up in my book and see like what grade you got in the class, and well, clearly you must have been okay. But you put that letter next to the letter from someone who has actually gotten to know you,
Mhm.
and even you providing them some background information will help make the letter stronger. So the letters are important, the experience is important in your personal statement, um, to show some sense of like your personality or your thought process instead of just attributes like I am this, I am that. If you tell like some brief story or scenario, it will be revealed that you are that, right? So I could say, oh, I'm very hardworking, right? Or I could say, I worked on this, and as a result of that, this happened. Then I say, oh, okay. And then I will say, because some people wonder about disclosing life challenges.
Mhm.
And so, two things I'll say about that. One, it may be important if that affects what we see in your transcript, right? Like some people didn't do well in undergrad and then did well in their master's. Well, some doctoral programs will see that and not think too much of the high grades in your master's because there's real grade inflation in graduate school. Most people are getting like high grades at that level,
Mhm.
but they see concern when they see this undergraduate transcript. And so it may be that like, and you may notice that in my junior year, my grades drop, and during that time, blah, 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 whatever context you would like to give. And, then by my senior year, I was able to pull it back up. So if it helps to explain, either gaps in your experience or your grades, um, and then if you're not sharing it for that, but you're sharing it because you want to talk about like why you're interested in the field and just show self-awareness, I would just say it's a balancing act because you want to also communicate like I have had or have these challenges, and I'm in a stable place and I've gotten support, and because what you don't want it to read as is this person is in crisis, right?
Mhm.
Or this person is going to be too overwhelmed to do our program. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but there is a way to do that, right? To talk about, you may have grown up in a home where there was child abuse, or, you went to like 5 different foster homes, but then, right, then I'm thankful because I have this stable place now and I've had mentorship and I want to, give back and go into the field to help children in foster care, right? Then I read that and I say, okay, like this will be a real contribution, not that I read it and I feel worried.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Thank you for, I think that's even like tangible advice for when you're thinking about applying to different jobs,
Mm-hmm.
for cover letter purposes,
Yeah.
not only
Internship.
Yes.
internship, okay?
Yes.
So not even just for
Mhm.
prospective students and graduate programs. So thank
Right.
you so much for that,
You're
Dr. Bryant.
welcome.
Yes. And what this made me think of was something that I listened to by you, your inaugural address at the Psychology of Black Women conference, which really, really touched me. And I had a lot to take away from that. And one thing in specific that I really enjoyed was the gardening tips that you
Mhm.
gave. So I listened to that sort of as ways to maintain and pour into yourself. And as a graduate student now, as a doctoral student, it definitely spoke to me. And I think it applies to, again, early career professionals in that you spoke to where is your place of excellence and
Mhm.
flourishing. And
Yeah.
earlier in the episode, you spoke to the different spaces you were in. So I like how you mentioned, are you built to work in systems in which we are
Yeah.
few,
Mhm.
and you're there as a transformer? Or, realizing, do I actually want to be in spaces where people look like me and
Mhm.
we are, in the
Right.
majority? So can you speak a little bit more to those points and finding your space and what works to you and where you
Right.
flourish?
Yes, it's so important. And that's why self-awareness is going to be key because everybody who you're around is going to have opinions,
Mm,
right, about
Mhm.
where you should be, right, and what you should be doing. So there's a whole bunch of shoulds, but you have to get still so you can realize what you feel called to do, what will be fulfilling for you, and also what you're built to do,
mhm,
right? So, and I when I say built for, I mean emotionally and personality wise,
Mhm.
right? So, for example, um, I can go into predominantly white spaces and do a presentation or a training on racism. And, people are going to ask the same kind of questions they generally ask. Um, and that doesn't deplete me, right? Like I don't get off that Zoom like, oh Lord, I can't do this. But there are some people who are like, I don't want to talk to them, right?
right.
Mhm.
I don't want to deal with those same questions. I don't want to talk to people who are going to deny that racism exists. Blah, blah, blah. And so to know, like, you have to know yourself, right? That's not all the work that I want to do, but I can do it and I can also see benefit from it. Like, not everybody's going to shift, but there are some people who it is more ignorance than malice. And so if I can
Mhm.
provide the information and I can see the light bulbs coming on, then I am equipped and good with doing that work.
Mhm,
So, it's like pay attention to what makes you come alive as you're doing it, and also pay attention to how you feel in the aftermath, right? So, for example, even with teaching, our lectures are 3 hours. um, I'm not starving for content, right? Right? Like at the end of the 3 hours, I'm like, oh my God, where'd the time go? Right.
mhm,
So because this is what I do. This is what I'm here to do. Whereas some people, the idea of that, like every week having to do that for like that amount of time would feel like draining, or it would feel like more labor than it is to me. Now,
mhm.
if you just wanted me to run stats all day, that would be like death.
Okay. Yes.
I'd be like, look, this just sit in front of my computer, like, oh, but I'm so grateful for those who that is their thing. I, worked with a wonderful psychologist, a great statistician as well, Dr. Yu Ying Song, and she comes alive in front of those numbers, right?
Mm,
So it's like find people, you don't have to do everything,
right.
right? So connecting with those who like that is their gifting, and then together you can do some incredible work.
For sure. Everyone definitely has their space and their place. And I
Yes.
love how you said that all are necessary for
Right.
this societal transformation, all parts,
Yeah.
not one being more important than the other.
Right. Yes. I think, those who are going to start their own organizations, phenomenal, right? I've had students, just a few, who've actually started their own nonprofits.
Mm,
That's
Mhm.
incredible. And
love
then I
that.
have students who go and work at, established um, clinics, community centers, who go, into the academy. Um, so all of it is needed. And so I think we have to be really careful about the hierarchy we create in the profession of who's doing real work,
Mhm,
right? So sometimes, practitioners can talk as if researchers and educators are not doing the real work. And then sometimes scientists will present themselves as like, this is the real work. These other people are not doing the real. So that also to me is like lack of self-awareness and healing. Like
mhm,
I don't need to stand on anyone's head to feel taller,
Mm.
right?
right.
Mhm.
So let everybody do their own work is all needed.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And when you reflect, you know what kind of work you need to do that will fulfill you the most.
Yes,
So,
yes.
well, I definitely want to make sure we have some time to talk about your newly released self-help book. So, Homecoming, Overcome Fear and Trauma to Reclaim Your Whole Authentic Self is a roadmap for dismantling the fear and shame that keep you from living a free and authentic life. Having made the journey herself, in addition to guiding others as a clinical psychologist and ordained minister, Dr. Bryant shows you how to reconnect with yourself and reclaim your time, your voice, your life by bridging the gap between clinical psychology and spiritual practices. As a survivor of sexual assault, as you mentioned earlier, racism, and evacuation from a civil war in Liberia, Dr. Bryant knows intimately the work involved in healing. Now, specifically relating your self-help book to a lot of the things that you've discussed with us, can you talk to us more about the importance of empowerment in your role in your work and in this self-help book?
Yes. So empowerment is that capacity to do. And it is really important. There's one thing of like shifting our mindset or healing from the past.
Mhm.
But ultimately, as we're healing, we want to find our voice, which you all picked up on, and we want to find our agency, right? Because stress and trauma leave you feeling often helpless or hopeless or
Mhm.
powerless. And so then that can keep us stuck because you have the actual barriers and then the additional psychological and emotional barriers. And so empowerment then has to be on all of those different levels, meaning I need to address the systemic barriers that we face. And that's a difference when we think about liberation psychology, African centered psychology, Black psychology,
Mhm.
womanist psychology, the psychology of Black women, um, that we want to address these various systems of oppression. And then we also want to provide people with the skill set to actually be able to occupy the fullness of their lives. And when we are using a cookie cutter approach or not paying attention to who's in front of us, then we can ignore the realities of marginalization.
Mm.
And so, if you're not recognizing that people are facing oppression, you don't recognize that empowerment is a part of their healing, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But when we recognize looking at our socio-cultural, our socio-historical reality, our socioeconomic reality, all of these dynamics, then we know that a part of healing is, and when we say empowerment, it's not power over other people, it is power to show up fully as myself.
Mm. Yes, I love that. And I had a chance to read some of your book, and it was really important to me how not only, sometimes in psychology, it can be looking at marginalized people from a deficit-based approach. And I really appreciate how you approach it from a strengths-based perspective. And although you talk about PTSD, community violence, and things of that nature, you also dedicate a huge portion of what you're talking about to post-traumatic growth and the
Mhm.
positives and the resiliency that comes from that.
Yes, it's so important. And I'll say, especially for those who are training or early career, when you're listening, and even those who are outside the field who might be listening, when I'm listening to people, I'm not just listening for the problems. And
Mm.
often at the top of the intake form, it's presenting problem, right? Name, demographics, presenting problem. And so I'm not just listening for that. That doesn't tell me the fullness of who I'm sitting in front of.
Mhm.
So I'm listening for the wisdom. I'm listening for what people have done to survive. I'm listening for the internal and the social resources, the cultural resources that sometimes people are not even aware of themselves because
Mm.
we often can be very critical of ourselves and our minds go to the things we did wrong. But it's remarkable the ways in which people have navigated life in really difficult circumstances. And so to highlight that to them, because sometimes there can be that fear of, you know, what is this person going to think of me, right? If I
Mm.
tell them, you know, what's happening in my life, what do they think? And what I think when I hear your life is that it makes sense.
Mhm.
Given the life that you have lived, it makes sense. And I also celebrate what you did to survive. Even if those are things you no longer want to have to do, you did make it here. So it allows us to see people more holistically.
And it also sounds like pointing out resiliency.
Yes.
So as we come to a close for today's show, I was wondering if there's anything else that you would like to share with us today, any tips, anything about yourself, anything that you feel we should know before we close out this episode.
Yes. I want to say, since the majority of your audience are students, that it's important that we not neglect or erase ourselves, that many times those who enter this field have a heart for others, which is really important. And I want to say you are deserving of the same care that you are so wanting to give other people. And so to know, especially I'll say to us as Black women, that that is not selfish, that is not being too demanding, to know that you are deserving, that you are worthy of being treated well,
Mm.
even by yourself.
I love that, leaving us with the word to extend some grace to ourselves in whatever season we're in and going through. So thank you so much, Dr. Bryant. I know I feel poured into after that, so I'm sure our listeners do as well. Thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you. And you all can feel free to follow me. My website is drthema.com, on Instagram, Twitter, and now TikTok, Dr. Thema. And the book is Homecoming.
Absolutely. Thank you again. And listeners, be sure to look out for updates from us and make sure that you are following us on social media as well at Psyched Podcast.
Yes, yes. Follow all the social media. Definitely love Dr. Bryant's Twitter and tweets and everything like that. So check us all out for the content that'll be coming up soon. Thank you so much all again. This is Psych the Podcast, and we hope to see you next time.